What if the world we inherited is not the world that truly existed? What if beneath our streets and inside our grandest buildings lies evidence of a forgotten civilization, one so advanced, so different, that its very memory had to be erased? The theory of the clean-up Mudflood dares to suggest exactly that. It claims a global catastrophe, buried cities, rewrote history, and eliminated a race of giants who once walked among monumental architecture. Historians reject it. Scientists dismiss it. Yet the questions persist, embedded in stone foundations and half-buried windows. Is this fantasy, or a chapter deliberately removed from our past? Origins of the Tartarian myth. You would think the idea of a buried global empire was the stuff of science fiction, right? Think about that for a second. What if the history books are not just slightly wrong, but entirely fabricated? The intellectual roots of this sweeping alternate reality stem from late 20th century Russian pseudo-history. Back in the 1970s and 80s, Anatoly Fomenko developed his new chronology, arguing that conventional historical timelines were completely forged to hide a dominant Slavic Turkic horde. Later, Nikolai Levashov expanded on these concepts, injecting occult elements that framed this lost civilization as a primordial society, possessing immense wisdom and power. For decades, these concepts remained confined to obscure circles in Russia. Then, between 2016 and 2018, a massive digital migration occurred. These complex ideas suddenly washed onto Western social media platforms like Reddit and TikTok, mutating into a viral, globalized conspiracy focused heavily on urban architecture. At the center of this belief system is the misinterpretation of antique maps. Spanning from the 13th to the 19th centuries, European mapmakers frequently labeled vast, uncharted stretches of North and Central Asia as Tartary or Tartaria. Proponents point to these massive landmasses on old maps, complete with distinct heraldry, as definitive proof of a unified sovereign empire that historians have deliberately erased from memory. In reality, this cartographic designation was nothing more than a cognitive placeholder. It was a catch-all term utilized by European cartographers for completely unknown Eastern lands. As centuries passed and geopolitical knowledge improved, this massive blank space was subdivided into more specific regions like Russian Tartary in Siberia and Chinese Tartary in Manchuria. By the late 19th century, the term vanished entirely, replaced by accurate political boundaries and specific names like Turkestan and Mongolia. The most revealing detail lies in the origin of the word itself. The indigenous people of the Eurasian steppe were primarily Turkic-Mongol ethnic groups known as Tatars. European writers purposefully added an extra letter R to the name, intentionally conflating the region with Tartarus, the hellish underworld of ancient Greek mythology. This linguistic twist proves the term was never the name of a magnificent, self-identified empire, but rather a Western label applied to a distant, misunderstood wilderness. The Great Mudflood Reset Cataclysm. Look closely at the older buildings in your own downtown area. Have you ever noticed those half-submerged windows sitting directly at street level, peering out from what we commonly accept as basements? Adherents of the Tartarian narrative point to these architectural anomalies as physical evidence of a terrifying event. They propose that sometime between 1850 and the early 20th century, a global cataclysm resulted in the sudden deposition of several meters of soil and mud across urban centers worldwide. This event, commonly referred to as the Mudflood, is not viewed as a natural disaster by theorists. Instead, it is framed as a weaponized cataclysm, a deliberate reset orchestrated to depopulate the Earth and physically bury the infrastructure of an advanced, technologically superior Old World civilization. The sheer volume of Earth supposedly moved during this period would have decimated populations and buried the original ground floors of magnificent structures across the globe, leaving only their upper levels exposed to the elements. Following this devastating deluge came a period theorists describe as the cleanup phase. A clandestine new ruling class, having survived or orchestrated the reset, allegedly spent decades retrofitting these massive stone ruins to suit the newly elevated street levels. They systematically bricked up the original, towering ground floor doors and roughly cut new entrances into what were once second-story windows. The current street level we walk on today is, according to this narrative, simply the top layer of mud that was never cleared away. This massive cover-up attempts to explain the jarring visual dissonance found in early historical photographs of cities like Chicago, San Francisco, and Moscow. These vintage images often feature magnificent, intricate neoclassical stone structures surrounded by primitive, unpaved dirt roads filled with deep ruts and horse-drawn carriages. The people captured in these photographs appear almost out of place, looking like primitive inheritors wandering through the grand ruins of a society they could never hope to replicate. It forces a striking visual contradiction and leads to a compelling rhetorical question. Why would master builders capable of engineering magnificent neoclassical masterpieces be utterly unable to pave a simple street? The power grid of Antiquitech. We now transition into the technological heart of this proposed old world, completely recontextualizing classical architecture. In the Tartarian narrative, the grand, ornate buildings of the past were not merely aesthetic achievements or monuments to artistic vision. They functioned as a massive, interconnected, and highly advanced global power grid. This concept, widely referred to as Antiquitech, suggests that the infrastructure of the Lost Empire was entirely functional, designed specifically to harness atmospheric electricity and etheric energy. When you examine specific architectural features through this technological lens, the familiar urban landscape takes on an entirely different purpose. Tall, pointed structures like steeples and obelisks were not built simply to reach toward the heavens for religious or monumental reasons. Instead, theorists argue they operated as massive antennas and conductors, drawing down static atmospheric electricity from the sky. The grand domes and cupolas crowning capitals and basilicas served as massive energy storage units, or capacitors, often claimed to have originally housed pools of mercury to aid in high-level conductivity. The defensive geometric earthworks, known as star forts, are also radically redefined. Rather than military bastions designed to repel cannon fire, these intricate, symmetrical layouts are viewed as giant cymatic circuit boards. Built strategically over massive bodies of water, they supposedly utilize the natural resonance of the earth and water to generate immense power. Even the grand cathedrals, rebranded in this theory as cathedromes, were part of the grid. The massive pipe organs and massive bells housed within them were allegedly not for music, but for producing precise acoustic frequencies meant to heal the human body and align the etheric self, with the cavernous stone building acting as a massive resonator. The eventual transition to modern, combustible energy systems is framed by adherents as a deliberate bastardization of nature. The shift toward burning coal and relying on metered electricity is seen as a calculated move by the new ruling class to suppress the free energy of the Tartarian era, ensuring absolute economic control over the population. The systematic removal of the concept of ether from the scientific lexicon, coupled with the sidelining of Nikola Tesla and his wireless transmission technologies, are cited as the final, deliberate actions taken to dismantle and bury the old world energy grid forever. Erasure of the tall ones. The sheer scale of old world architecture naturally leads theorists to a bizarre biological conclusion regarding the original inhabitants of these grand structures. The Mudflood narrative extends its historical revisionism directly into human biology, claiming that the pre-flood civilization was populated by a race of humans possessing a much greater physical stature. Adherents commonly refer to these beings as the Tall Ones. They argue that the existence of these giants was systematically erased from the historical record by the new ruling class, a deliberate suppression designed to prevent modern humanity from realizing its true biological potential and achieving a higher state of existence. The primary evidence cited for this vanished race of giants is drawn entirely from the surviving built environment. Proponents point to the massive entrances of European cathedrals and American state houses, where solid doors often reach staggering heights of 15 to 25 feet. In the conspiracy narrative, these are not symbolic thresholds, but literal, functional requirements for a giant population. Similarly, the widespread prevalence of 30-foot ceilings in 19th century public buildings is interpreted as definitive proof of massive inhabitants rather than an aesthetic choice. Theorists also frequently share and analyze vintage photographs where certain individuals appear disproportionately large, claiming these visual anomalies are glitches in the grand cover-up where the tall ones were not successfully edited out of the historical record. Architectural historians provide a much more grounded reality to counter these extraordinary biological claims. The colossal scale of these structures is firmly rooted in the ancient principles of monumental design. Imposing doors and soaring ceilings were historically intended to inspire awe, communicate the immense power of the state or church, and comfortably accommodate the massive scale of public processions. Furthermore, the immense height of these ceilings served a vital engineering function in the pre-electric era. Before artificial lighting and mechanical ventilation, taller rooms were an absolute necessity. They allowed for the installation of massive windows, which enabled natural sunlight to penetrate deep into a building's interior. The sheer volume of expansive ceilings also prevented the dangerous stagnation of heat and smoke generated by gas lamps and fireplaces, naturally drawing toxic air upward and away from the people below. The orphan train repopulation mystery. The narrative takes a deeply unsettling turn when examining the human cost of this alleged reset. The focus shifts from buried buildings to the most vulnerable members of society, presenting a chilling theory regarding the repopulation of the Earth. Between 1854 and 1929, organizations like the Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Hospital orchestrated a massive social experiment. They relocated an estimated 300,000 children from the crowded cities of the American East to the expanding rural West. Mainstream history views this immense logistical effort as a deeply flawed precursor to the modern foster care system. Within the conspiracy narrative, this historical event is completely reframed as something far more sinister. Theorists propose a terrifying alternative to the official story, suggesting these hundreds of thousands of displaced youths were not actually orphans in the traditional sense. Instead, they are viewed as the traumatized survivors of the global mud deluge. According to this dark interpretation, after the adult population was wiped out or deliberately eliminated, the remaining children were rounded up and placed into state-run institutions. The ultimate goal of this mass relocation, adherents argue, was to completely strip these survivors of their Tartarian heritage. They were allegedly shipped out on trains to re-inhabit the newly excavated, empty cities of the West, serving as a docile blank slate for the new ruling class. The most chilling piece of evidence cited for this massive psychological operation is a documented historical directive. Many young train riders were explicitly instructed by their handlers to completely forget their past upon arriving at their new homes. Theorists interpret this heartbreaking guidance not as a misguided attempt at a fresh start, but as a literal, systemic brainwashing program designed to permanently erase all memory of the previous world and ensure the absolute success of the historical reset. The fairs and grand deception. Look at the sprawling, magical cities constructed for the late 19th century exhibitions, specifically the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition and the 1915 San Francisco Panama Pacific Exposition. It challenges the imagination to believe that ordinary laborers with wooden carts built massive cities of gleaming marble and gold in a matter of mere months, only to deliberately demolish them shortly after. Within the Mudflood narrative, these massive, short-lived exhibitions are considered central battlegrounds. Proponents completely reject the official construction timelines. Instead, they present a captivating alternative theory, claiming these grand fairs were actually highly orchestrated showings. They argue the public was simply invited to walk through the very last surviving Tartarian capital cities before the clandestine ruling class destroyed the evidence forever as a final act of the global cleanup phase. However, the engineering reality of the era completely dismantles this grand deception. Historical research reveals the true secret behind the rapid construction of the famous White City. Most of these magnificent fair buildings were not solid stone, but were constructed using an impermanent, highly flammable material known as staff. This was a temporary mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and fibrous binding materials like hemp or jute. The staff was not a load-bearing material. It was simply a superficial, lightweight skin molded into intricate classical shapes and nailed over temporary wooden and steel skeletons to perfectly imitate the appearance of solid, carved marble. This ingenious method allowed thousands of laborers to assemble pre-cast decorations at an astonishing pace that traditional stone masonry could never achieve. The rapid deterioration and eventual demolition of the fairgrounds were inevitable due to the material's severe susceptibility to fire and weather. The structural contrast is clear when looking at the Palace of Fine Arts in Chicago. Unlike the rest of the rapidly assembled exposition, this specific structure featured a permanent brick and steel core beneath its temporary staff facade, allowing it to survive while the surrounding temporary marvels burned and crumbled exactly as they were engineered to do. Engineering. The razing of Chicago. During the mid-19th century, Chicago was essentially a low-lying swamp with virtually no natural drainage. This flat, marshy geography led to stagnant water and devastating public health crises. Between 1854 and 1860, the city suffered repeated massive outbreaks of cholera and typhoid. Diseases spread rapidly through contaminated water. A single outbreak in 1854 wiped out 6% of the entire population. To save the city from collapsing under the weight of its own sanitation crisis, engineer Ellis S. Chesbrough proposed a radical solution. He designed a comprehensive citywide gravity-based sewerage system. Because the terrain was completely flat, the only way to make the waste flow away from the city was to physically lift the entire urban center between 4 and 12 feet out of the mud. This was not a subtle public works project. It involved filling the old streets with massive amounts of soil and physically jacking up existing, fully occupied brick and stone buildings to meet the newly elevated grade. One of the most spectacular feats occurred in 1860 at the Row on Lake Street. This was a solid, continuous block of masonry buildings measuring 320 feet long and weighing an astonishing 35,000 tons. To accomplish this massive lift, 600 men positioned themselves in the subterranean darkness, turning 6,000 jack screws in perfect unison. Over the course of 5 days, they lifted the entire block nearly 5 feet into the air. The astounding part of this mechanical triumph was that the businesses inside continued to operate normally, with customers coming and going as the floors slowly rose beneath their feet. The following year, the Tremont House, a massive 1-acre 6-story brick hotel, was smoothly raised 6 feet while guests remained comfortably in their rooms. Despite the overwhelming amount of historical documentation surrounding these monumental engineering achievements, theorists completely reject the official historical narrative. They view the extensive stories of thousands of coordinated jack screws as an elaborate, fabricated cover story. In their view, coordinating 600 men to perfectly lift a brick city block is simply an impossible feat. They argue instead that the buried lower stories, seen in before and after photographs, are actually the raw, unedited aftermath of the Great Mud Deluge. The buried city of Seattle. Shifting our focus to the Pacific Northwest, we encounter an urban landscape that is quite literally buried. Following the devastating Great Seattle Fire of 1889, city leaders faced the monumental task of rebuilding 30 blocks of their ruined downtown business district. They seized this unprecedented opportunity to permanently solve the chronic tidal flooding that plagued the low-lying Pioneer Square area. Their solution was an engineering marvel built on sheer brute force. Engineers deployed massive hydraulic water cannons to forcefully wash away the steep hills to the north. They sluiced the resulting deluge of dirt and mud directly into the flooded downtown basin, ultimately raising the street levels by an astonishing 22 to 30 feet. During this massive construction phase, resourceful business owners simply adapted to the rising tide of earth. They moved their main commercial storefronts up to the second floors of their buildings, leaving the original ground floors to become damp subterranean storage areas. Eventually, wide sidewalks were constructed over the large gaps spanning between the newly elevated streets and the original building facades, inadvertently creating the sprawling, shadowy network known today as the Seattle Underground. For proponents of the Tartarian narrative, this vast subterranean labyrinth is viewed as the ultimate physical proof. They claim the underground is an unexcavated remnant of an ancient Tartarian city that was simply too deep and massive to fully erase during the global reset. Theorists point specifically to the vault lights embedded in the modern sidewalks above as absolute confirmation of their claims. These are small, purple-tinted glass prisms set flush into the pavement, which believers interpret as ancient skylights, proving the people living below were once walking in the open sun. Historians and engineers easily decode this architectural feature without resorting to cataclysms. These thick glass prisms were actually a highly ingenious and incredibly common piece of Victorian technology. Long before the advent of widespread electrical grids, these heavy glass lenses were specifically designed to capture and refract natural sunlight from the street level, safely projecting vital illumination down into the dark, newly created subterranean storefronts below. The stratified history of London. Crossing the Atlantic, we find another prime location frequently used by the Mudflood narrative. London offers a perfect case study in how ancient cities naturally bury themselves over millennia through a process of continuous human habitation and urban stratification. Beneath the bustling modern streets of the financial district, the remnants of Roman Londinium currently sit 12 meters below the surface. This immense depth is not the result of a sudden apocalyptic deluge of mud, but rather 2,000 years of relentless building, demolition, and the steady accumulation of debris that gradually pushes the street level upward. Digital mud hunters frequently highlight specific urban anomalies to push their narrative of a vanished world. A favorite target is Little Compton Street in Soho. Peering down through modern sewer grates, pedestrians can still spot original Victorian street signs embedded deep within the subterranean brickwork. To a conspiracy theorist, this is undeniable proof of a buried city. The documented engineering reality is far more practical. During the major urban redevelopment and construction of Charing Cross Road in 1896, the entire street grade was intentionally raised. This massive infrastructure project effectively sealed over Little Compton Street, transforming what was once an active open-air thoroughfare into a subterranean utility tunnel. Similar practical explanations easily debunk other supposed anomalies found scattered across the London pavement. Theorists often point to the sunken areas and small iron grates lining the sidewalks, claiming they are the tops of flood-buried doors and windows belonging to ancient structures. In reality, these are simply coal holes and airways. They represent standard, highly functional Victorian infrastructure specifically designed to provide essential light and ventilation to subterranean basements, while allowing heavy deliveries of heating coal to be poured directly from the street level down into residential cellars. Geological reality and scientific consensus. If a massive wall of mud swept across the entire planet as recently as the 19th century, a glaring logical question remains regarding the whereabouts of all this displaced Earth. The scientific and geological consensus remains completely unified in its absolute dismissal of this global event, pointing to a severe lack of physical evidence. If a massive deluge capable of burying the first floors of buildings worldwide had actually occurred, it would have undeniably left a highly distinct, uniform stratigraphic layer of fine silt stretched across the entire planet. Every continent would bear the exact same massive geological scar from this catastrophic period. Instead, when modern geologists and construction crews dig deep into urban environments, they do not find a pristine, uniform layer of reset mud. They uncover a messy, highly localized mixture of natural clay, scattered boulders, glacial drift, and centuries of accumulated human garbage. The earth beneath our modern cities tells a slow, gradual story of local environmental history and anthropogenic waste, not a sudden apocalyptic deposition. Furthermore, a global event designed to deliberately depopulate the earth and wipe out an entire advanced civilization would have left behind a massive casualty layer. The complete absence of mass human remains within this supposed uniform mud layer completely shatters the entire depopulation aspect of the reset timeline. Archaeological data continuously refutes this timeline as well. Excavations beneath these allegedly buried buildings consistently uncover the older foundations of earlier, less sophisticated structures. This proves a clear, natural progression of building techniques over centuries, rather than a sudden, devastating drop from an advanced peak to a primitive 19th century state. The heavy reliance of the theory on visual anomalies entirely ignores standard architectural practices. When theorists point to massive brick walls extending deep below the modern street level, they are not looking at buried ground floors. They are simply observing deep foundations, an absolute structural necessity designed to safely anchor massive, heavy stone buildings into the earth to ensure structural stability. The common use of ground-level windows was also just a practical way to provide natural light and ventilation to these essential subterranean service areas. The allure of stolen heritage. The persistence of the Tartarian mudflood theory, despite its overwhelming scientific implausibility, points to a profound cultural need. Hundreds of thousands of individuals desperately want to believe they are living atop the magnificent ruins of a lost civilization. This massive digital movement is driven by three distinct psychological undercurrents. The first driver is a deep aesthetic discontent with the brutalist and utilitarian nature of modern architecture. By ascribing the ornate, classical beauty of historical buildings to an advanced, erased empire, believers are expressing a profound yearning for a more enlightened and aesthetically pleasing past. The stark contrast between classical masterpieces and modern concrete structures fuels a sense of profound cultural loss. This aesthetic longing is tightly intertwined with a severe, systemic institutional distrust. The overarching narrative suggests a terrifying absolute. If the government, academia, and mainstream media have collectively lied about the true origins of the built environment, then every established narrative is suspect. The physical buildings serve as the ultimate wedge issue, opening the door to dismiss everything from modern energy systems to fundamental human biology. Finally, this conspiracy thrives as a highly engaging form of participatory mythology, functioning essentially as the QAnon of architecture. In the modern digital age, it transforms the mundane urban landscape into an active, interactive treasure hunt. Anyone with a smartphone can walk down their local downtown street, observe a standard basement window, and instantly feel like a rogue explorer, uncovering the ultimate stolen heritage of humanity. The theory provides a comforting, empowering narrative, allowing individuals to believe they are actively rediscovering a lost, higher state of human existence hidden directly beneath the literal and metaphorical mud of history.